with demand expected to come back, the question remains, does this mean the economy is back on track?
Companies now, after experimenting with offshore in places like India, Philippines, and Poland, want to bring those jobs back.
We invest in the U.S. We're the biggest exporter in the country. In the cycle we're in right now, we're creating jobs.
From Radio America, it's Neil Asbury's Made in America, the show that explores American industry, large and small, and promotes American-made products everywhere. Put Neil Asbury's Made in America to work for you.
A very big welcome to you today. I'm your host, Neil Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman. So it is official this week. The House voted along party lines. What was it? Pelosi said, hey, for an impeachment process to be real, it has to be bipartisan. Well, obviously, this is anything but bipartisan. But what I want to ask, and what I think we need to talk about, and we'll discuss it here throughout the show today, is what does an impeachment process economy look like? Now, back during Bill Clinton's impeachment, it was the go-go 90s. The 90s with the tech boom, was a very, very economic, this huge expansion of our economy during this impeachment process during the late 90s. So what will it look like this time around? Now, there's a lot of great things happening in the economy, but there's also some headwinds out there. Do you have any prediction what does an impeachment process economy look like this time?
Exactly what you see on television right now.
Well, that's a train wreck, and I hope that's not what we get in our economy.
Listen, it really hasn't changed anything. First of all, the bill that was passed this week, by the way, for those out there, it was 232 Democrats voting yes, obviously, against 196 Republicans. I'm very proud of them. They all stayed together on this. And one independent, Justin Amish, who hates the president anyway, out of Michigan. He's very independent, and he's probably a contrarian. So, but that's the way it went. But if you read it and you understand what it's all about, the truth of the matter is it really doesn't change anything, except it kind of gives some more empowerment to, Shifty Schiff. The Republicans can now ask him if they can see something, sort of like a Charles Dickens "More, please." And they either hit you or they let you have some more porridge. So we're not really any different than we were before the vote. It's still lousy. It's still not due process. It still seems fairly unconstitutional, or totally unconstitutional, I should say. And we're really not sure what this does. It really mean anything different this week than last week? And I really don't think so.
Well, very good.
That help?
Excellent.
Just saying.
You just put it all in
thinking about
context for me.
I tried very hard for you, Neil.
Hey, but Rich, we're very, very pleased to have back joining us Mark Hammrick from Bankrate.com, who's a senior economic analyst, and there's so much going on in our economy. And Mark, welcome to Made in America. A lot of things happening that impacts our jobs, and a lot to talk to you about. A lot of headlines this week. But the Fed cut the interest rates, which I think that the president was really pushing for. But then he tweets this week, China is not the problem, the Federal Reserve is. So don't take yes for an answer.
He does that every time. He takes on Jay Powell. Every time they do something good, bad, or indifferent, he comes right down on Jay Powell.
It's never enough.
It's a little predictable.
So, Mark, what say you?
With respect to whether it's enough or not, first of all, I'm trying to remember how it was that Jay Powell got that job. And I seem to remember that Janet Yellen had the job before him, and the president basically didn't want to renominate her, so he nominated Jay Powell. So there is a bit of irony there. As per usual, I attended the chairman's news conference. I think it pretty much went according to script, to the degree that we thought we had an idea about what was going to happen. Obviously, it's the third interest rate cut, taking back 3 of the 9 that we got since of the 9 increases that we got since 2015, and Powell was fairly, I would say, emphatic that the committee believes that monetary policy, the level of interest rates, now is where they need to be to maintain the current level of the U.S. economy, which is modest growth. We saw the most recent estimate for Q3, 1.9% annualized growth. The Federal Reserve's estimate of growth over the long term is 1.9%. So there is some continuity there. I can guarantee you, though, that if the economy starts looking particularly weak or there is particular volatility in financial markets, they'll be shaking up the game plan once again.
Well, let me ask you a question on this, because it seems like, the president had said, and I think a lot of people agree, that 9 raises in the time period you just talked about was an onerous amount. And it really did hurt the economy, during that Christmas season, at the end of the year. And now the feds this year have really backtracked, 3, although they're saying they're going to go in a holding pattern for a while. To a degree, it kind of validates what a lot of people have been talking about, that they overdid what they did, so to speak. Pardon the redundancy. But they did, or didn't they?
Well, history will give us a better idea about that. I think we're still, in the process of trying to make sure that the expansion does continue. Obviously, 11 years old. I have to tell you, I worked here in Washington for more than 3 decades, and at least professionally, I removed myself from a process a long time ago of trying to view everything through the prism of whether it validates or repudiates the view of a given administration. I don't drink that Kool-Aid in any administration, and I'm not doing it now. But it is important with respect to the fact that we're a year out from the general election, a presidential election, and unfortunately America is so divided now. Those are the prisms that many Americans also view the facts or lack thereof.
So, Mark, just because the Fed reduces interest rates by 0.25% doesn't mean that our small businesses and entrepreneurs are getting a reduction in their rate. And it doesn't, just pass through. And, there's been a lot of talk about bringing our manufacturing jobs back home. But there was a headline this week that manufacturing is just 11% of our GDP, and it's the lowest since 1947. So despite all of this discussion about bringing our manufacturing jobs back, it still isn't happening. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think that's consistent with, number one, most expectations, and number 2, the reality of the current state of play with respect to U.S. trade policy, the fact that essentially, the administration decided it was necessary to take these steps in order to try to force agreements, and so it remains to be seen whether agreements can be forged. I don't think that anyone is predicting, for example, that you're going to resolve everything with respect to the U.S. and China anytime in the near future, and obviously the global economy is hurting as well, and trade policy plays into that somewhat, if not more so. I think the problem is that many people have a high degree of nostalgia, and they are somehow wishing that globalization can be fully put back in a bottle. I think that's rather difficult to do. I think a broader long-term question is what kind of jobs are sort of appropriate for the U.S. at this point in the evolution of our history, our economy, and our country. I don't hear a lot of discussion about that, quite frankly. What I do hear a lot of discussion about is sort of trying to bring jobs back that might have existed 40, 50 years ago, including coal.
Well, you know what I'm intrigued with, Neal, now that you said that? Well, you said it was manufacturing was 11% of GDP?
Is now. And
now 11%.
And the lowest since 1947.
Oh, okay. That's very interesting.
Well, see, Rich, here's the deal: is that what I think is the misconception is bringing back manufacturing jobs. A, do they really fit? But I'm a U.S. manufacturer. Mm-hmm. I employ 700
people. That's why I'm intrigued with this.
But the idea is that once you lose that whole generation of tool makers and die makers and the sort of the manufacturing culture, it's not a light switch. You just don't turn it on and turn it off. I mean, this is a long-term commitment to bring back manufacturing, and it's not something that happens in 24 months.
So,
well,
having said that, go ahead.
I think one thing you're leaving out of the discussion, though, is the value of output. Automation plays a substantial role in manufacturing, as perhaps more so than any other industry, and so it's not a reasonable assumption to think that, let's say, if we brought back comparable output from whatever point in the past for manufacturing, that there's going to be the same level of employment. No, robotics play a big role of that, as do other aspects of sort of machinery and computerization. And so last check, it looks to me like also the value of output was roughly 10% of GDP in the United States. So to that degree, it is somewhat aligned with the manufacturing piece, but I don't think it's a reasonable expectation to say that the level of employment can significantly accelerate simply because there is so much automation and other forms of high tech involved with manufacturing.
Mark, yeah, we got to take a quick break, but I would suggest that someone has to make that automation, supply the automation, and service the automation, and those are still manufacturing jobs as well, but and very good paying jobs. But Mark, hold that thought for a second. We're on with Mark Hammrick from Bankrate.com. We're going to be back just in a moment. We got still plenty of things to talk about.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman, and we're together with Mark Hammrick from Bankrate.com, who is a senior economic analyst there, based in Washington, D.C. So, Rich, got to get you into this discussion here on Brexit. What is happening in the UK? Is Brexit, is it closer or is it further away based on this delay?
You know, I got to find it amazing. I do watch Parliament, when I get up in the morning. Yeah, if you want to watch something that's really wonderful and exciting, and it's the next level of Monty Python, I watch the British Parliament, because I just find it to be fascinating watching them yell and, stand up and sit down and stand up and, rally around whomever.
The honorable gentleman.
Yeah, but I was listening to Nigel Farage.
Okay, he's the Brexit guy, right?
Yeah, and he was basically saying, well, I'll tell you, if Boris would just go along with a hard break, then I suppose I would be there and I would support him. I'm trying to do the best Nigel that I can, by the way, and which I don't think is going to happen. But it is one of the most confusing votes I have ever seen in my life. Because if you're from the outside, particularly from the States, and you're looking in, they say, well, wait a minute, didn't we vote on this? Didn't they vote on this years ago? So it's not happening. And then it is going to happen. And then, well, we're going to put it off. And then we're going to vote again on it and see if we like it. But we really don't like it. We're having trouble with the Labor Party. So we're going to have another vote. And the Labor Party says, well, I'm not so sure I want to vote. And so I find it as confusing as trying to put a government together in Israel, which I find totally confusing.
So, Mark, a good point. You just mentioned about how globalization and the genie's out of the bottle and you can't put it back in the bottle. Globalization is something that's real. You got to embrace it. And you can be incredibly successful if you can figure it out. So what is your read on the UK?
Well, I think that was a good assessment just now. But I do think the strategy largely is one of trying to kick the can down the road and hoping that somehow there can be a more useful consensus with respect to how to forge ahead. I mean, think about the fact that as we speak, this was the earlier deadline, and it's not happening at this time. So, this is one of the factors that Chairman Powell mentioned at his news conference, that the fact that Brexit isn't happening immediately, and certainly not a hard Brexit, along with the at least prospects for the so-called Phase 1 trade deal between the U.S. and China. These are some more optimistic signals that we couldn't latch on to not that long ago.
But I want to ask this question to you, because I enjoy listening to you and your thought processes. Why is Nigel Farage pushing for a hard break? What's the advantage to that he feels, getting it over and moving forward and developing one-on-one trade on their own? What's the? I mean, I can see lots of disadvantages to to the European economy. But tell me what your thoughts are on that. It's very intriguing.
Well, I don't. First of all, I don't want to suggest to your wise audience that I'm someone who analyzes the UK closely and has a great deal of understanding about the political scene there. I'm probably much the same as others who are as much right now mystified by it as anything. But I think let's put it in a broader context. I think what is happening there is very similar to what has happened in the United States and to some degree in some other countries, and that is that there has been a very almost violent reaction to globalization, and so so-called nativism, or other words, nationalism that have come to be applied to that. These have been the responses. In other words, to say, the sort of global community that we find ourselves in part because of things like the World Trade Organization or NAFTA and other aspects of that, high degrees of immigration from other countries that in some cases are seen by locals, you might say, as having sort of taken the jobs away. I think that's what it's all about in my view, and also I think the UK has a proud tradition that to get back to the notion of nostalgia, when it was truly a British Empire, obviously not so much anymore, but I think that at some point trying to think back about the grand history of the UK, I think many people sort of wish that it could be as it was before, and then see the fact that to the degree that they're part of the European community, they're not fond of that.
So, Mark, in a short time that we have left, President Trump next year, 2020, is going to be running on the economy.
Yeah.
What kind of economy will he be running on?
That's a very good question. I think right now, I don't think the risks of a recession in the near future are high. So that means we probably get more trend-like growth. It's hard to put together a scenario where you have a significant acceleration in the U.S. economy. But I think Americans in many ways have, perhaps not in a fond sense, but have become somewhat accustomed to the kind of growth that we've seen very recently and over the longer term. But jobs growth is slowing, and that is true in the private sector as well as the goods producing sector. So we probably need to brace ourselves to the possibility that we've seen the bottom in the unemployment rate. It's not a sure thing, and it doesn't absolutely need to be that way. But I think 3.5% is where I had said probably 2 years ago that I thought we could go. Some people thought that was overly optimistic, and sure enough, we got there. But we're not really seeing the 200,000 jobs a month piece like we saw last year.
Hey, Mark, thanks a lot. I mean, we really appreciate you coming on the show. Mark Hammrick from Bankrate.com. Mark, thanks for being on the show.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Coming up, we have Chong Xiang from the Krannert School of Management going to talk about a lot of things, including what is going on with the U.S.-China proposed, and it's only right now proposed, trade agreement. Will it get done?
Made in America.
Sharply higher at the open, stocks continued to perform well over the course of the day Tuesday.
And I think that bodes well here over the next couple of years for having bigger demands coming to this country.
Now, more of Neal Asbury's Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman. So, Rich, we got to move on right now. We're going to talk about China and tariffs and what's going on with that. A bit of an update. President Trump and President Xi were supposed to meet in Chile at the APEC summit. Now, because of unrest in Chile, they've canceled it. I mean, that's amazing. They canceled the APEC summit.
But they're going to reschedule. They announced this week, towards the end of the week, they're going to reschedule and pick up another date so they can sign something.
Or I've heard that President Trump is just saying, hey, look, we got to meet somewhere and we got to get a deal done. But then there's a news report that maybe China's balking a bit about what this agreement is. And they're backtracking. Now, remember, back in May, according to the president, China was ready to sign, and then they changed the whole deal, and it blew apart, and that's why we have these 25% tariffs in place right now, which are really cutting through the American economy and very much also the China economy. So let's talk about that. And so many jobs are at stake here. We just talked about manufacturing is just 11% of our GDP. It's the lowest since 1947. What kind of economy should the U.S. have? What type of jobs should we be creating in our country? Obviously, good paying jobs with good benefits. But what is the definition of that? A lot is riding on this. We're very pleased to have on Chong Xiang from the Krannert School of Management. It's at Purdue University. Great school. He is an economic professor. Chong, welcome to Made in America.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So we're trying to read the tea leaves here and figure out what's going on. And you're so much better connected to this than we. I mean, President Trump seems to be pretty eager to put this phase one deal in place. He wants to find a place to go and sign this thing. Is President Xi as motivated as it seems President Trump is? Will this blow up like it has in the past? Where is there some light at the end of the tunnel?
That's a great question. Looking at the agreements that have been outlined so far, well, it's an agreement / no agreement, because the agreement is things will not get worse from now going forward. The U.S. has committed not to put additional tariffs on China's exports. And China has agreed to.
But Chong, let me just. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me ask you: has the U.S. agreed to that? Because on December 15th, there's another 15% tariffs that are basically on every consumer product imaginable that we import from China, and I don't believe there's any decision made to delay the December 15th tariffs. So it can get worse, or maybe I'm wrong.
So let me clarify. So what I meant was that for now, the U.S. will not put additional tariffs on China's exports in October, as was previously the case. So that was what I meant. I was not talking about what's been planned for December. So thanks for correcting me on that. On the other hand, China has made promises to purchase more U.S. farm products. And China has promised to purchase a grand sum in billions of U.S. dollars, but the time period through which the purchase will be made was not spelled out specifically. So that's what the gist of the agreement is. And going forward, will they sign that into a formal agreement? That's kind of hard to predict, and I'll leave it as that.
So this is Rich. Let me ask you this. There are a couple of things in the agreement that, you were just talking about. They would agree to buy billions of dollars more product. Well, the number that's been bantered around is $50 billion worth of agricultural product, which is huge. That's a huge amount of money that they would spend, and it would be a boon to the farmers of this country. So that's one concern that I thought we could discuss. And number two, what happens to the protection of intellectual property rights in this short-term deal?
Let's talk about the first question, and then let's move on to the second question. The $50 billion number is huge, very impressive. But keep in mind that, according to my reading, they have not committed to doing the purchase in a single year. And it could be spread out in 5 years or 10 years, in which case it will be, less impressive. So that's the first one. And moving on to the second question about the protection of intellectual property rights, you are exactly right. It's not been addressed in the Phase 1 agreement. At this moment, the whole trade dispute with China is so complex that it's nice to get any agreement done, so to speak, because it's really about a lot of things at the same time.
So, Chong, I'm an American manufacturer. I own a number of American companies. I have a lot of employees that obviously is a big responsibility. One of the companies I own is Venturi. We're a manufacturer of wine accessories, and we own a patent for wine aeration, a really great product. Now, we've been knocked off in China. But the really sad thing about it is that they have not only knocked off our patent, but also our trade dress and trademark. They're selling counterfeit products in the United States. They're selling it on websites with impunity. They're shipping this product in directly from China. They're using the subsidized U.S. postal rates that we have because of some agreement we signed 100 years ago to help, developing countries to be able to, get mail and do it at a much less cost. They're using that against me. And China doesn't seem to want to do anything about counterfeiting and fake products. Yet China, President Xi, is going around the world talking about how China is the country that's supporting free trade and the World Trade Organization, and we got to have a good, fair trade agreements around the world, and we're the ones on the side of free trade. But that is a bunch of baloney. What say you?
First of all, I'm sorry to hear about what happened to your company. And anytime a manufacturer loses its intellectual property, it's a big setback. And I'm extremely sympathetic to your situation. And personally, I've heard a lot of other examples of intellectual property violations in China. And you are exactly right. The protection of intellectual property is weak in China, and that's a major reason why the United States is having the trade dispute. So we say it's a trade dispute, but really it has very little to do with trade per se. It's motivated by things like the intellectual property rights, forced technology transfer, the use of subsidies, which you also mentioned, and a host of other sort of issues and reasons. So that's why I said earlier it's such a complex issue, and to get any deal done is impressive. Now, that being said,
John, we got to take a quick break, but I want to ask a follow-up question. I know that Rich wants to get back into this. We're talking to economic professor Chong Xiang from the Krannert School of Management at Purdue University. A very, very important discussion about our trade relationships with China. Stay with us. You don't want to miss it.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, and we're joined with Chong Xiang, who's an economic professor at the Krannert School of Management at Purdue University. So, Chong, let me just follow up on this. Concerning intellectual property, and China has benefited so much after ascending to the WTO and the World Trading System. They've really done remarkable things in building their country over the last 30 years. And isn't it time to say, okay, we are a normal country and we are going to protect intellectual property like we would expect our intellectual property to be protected. We're benefiting from the global economy. There's many people. There's a huge booming middle class in China. So many people have become wealthy in China. So why can't China concede that protecting intellectual property is an important thing amongst normal countries?
Your question is exactly what I would like to say. China is a large country, and there are lots of Chinese firms that are active in doing their own innovation. They have their own intellectual property, and they want to protect their own intellectual property against counterfeiting in China and in the rest of the world. And so IPR protection, IPR meaning intellectual property rights, is in the best interest not only of the United States, but also for China itself. And so that's a sort of basis for some optimism going forward. But then, of course, China is a large country, a lot of different interest groups, and many local governments probably deeply connected with local business who has benefited in the past from IPR thefts. And it's, as we say, a complex issue. Now, to be fair, there are laws in China specifically about protecting intellectual property rights. The issue is always, are they going to enforce those laws to the full extent of the law?
You know, sometimes it's very draconian in terms of the theft of intellectual property rights, because a number of companies that have worked with China have had their intellectual property stolen, and they've actually gone bankrupt. They've gone out of business. And so since this is very high up on President Trump's agenda in terms of stopping this theft, and it would appear, and I think you're very right in what you said, that this seems to be part of the intellectualism of the Chinese in terms of doing business. So you have to be able to change that intellectual attitude, that paradigm that they're in, that it's just standard procedure that we're going to go ahead and do this. And if you want to work with us, you got to transfer all your information about your products to us. So we have to have that on file, and maybe even encrypted on file. You know, maybe that's why folks like Gordon Chang and others who have been on the show. Gordon's been on a number of times, and he's on constantly. And I'm interested in this. Gordon believes in high tariffs. He doesn't care. He says 25%. They should be 50%, because he actually believes that something at some point has to be stopped. So I'm very curious as to what you think about that.
I mean, that's a very good question. To be fair, there are lots of cases about the abuse of intellectual property in China, and the victims include U.S. companies that are owned by foreign entities, and in many cases, the victims also included Chinese domestic companies. And so people have examined the number of court cases in China about intellectual property disputes, and those cases have been rising over time. And there are economic studies that use those changes in court cases to gauge how good a job China is doing in terms of protecting intellectual property rights in general. So clearly, they are doing something. But, obviously, what they have done so far is not enough. It's not adequate. And so that raises the question, what's the best way to change a large country's behavior, who has the second largest economy in the entire world, and where, information does not always flow in a free way. And, some people believe that tariff is a good way to go, and I respect that view. But are there other ways of doing this? So let me point out a few things that the United States did. Many of the issues, intellectual property rights and forced technology transfer and rules of law, were explicitly addressed in an agreement that we walked away from, the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement. And if we want to change China's behavior, it seems easier if we have other countries on our side. Right? And simultaneously, we're having trade disputes not only with China, but also with our allies and friends, Canada, because we are putting tariffs on aluminum and steel. It seems easier if we can have our allies on our side and speak with the same voice.
Chong, thanks for your thoughts. You've been a great guest. We hope you're going to come back and join us. We've been talking with Chong Xiang, who's an economic professor at the Krannert School of Management, Purdue University. Chong, thanks for coming on the show. Coming up, Dr. Rothman and I are going to have some final thoughts for the day.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neal Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Ruffman. So, Rich, I still don't get why China, and by the way, I mean, the government there is omnipresent. I mean, it's all powerful. I mean, it's like if they want it, it is. It's not like special interests in China. I don't
really?
know. I don't know how much the special interests.
How special would that be?
Yeah. If President Xi wants it, he does it. I mean, that's the way it works over there. And if President Xi says, hey, look, guys, we're going to have to protect intellectual property because it's in our interest to do so, it's done. So for the life of me, I just don't get why we're not to that point. I mean, we're to that point. We're past that point. I just don't know why he just doesn't do that, because I think it's in China's best interest. And Chong just said, Professor Chong just said, hey, look, China is also developing intellectual property. Isn't China 2025, what started this whole thing, about China trying to ascend to this global player in robotics and artificial intelligence and in technology and all of that? You would think that they're going to have a lot of intellectual property as a result of this. Of which they would want to be protected, just like we want to be protected.
That's right. So except the difference is we would actually respect that. You see, we don't have that psychology to steal it from them. That's not in our DNA, Neil.
Yeah,
but it is in theirs.
Because it's I guess it's a cultural thing. I guess it's a cultural thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and if you want to play ball over there, since I happen to like basketball, except in Hong Kong, they like playing basketball. Then either you play by their rules or take your ball and go home.
So there's a couple of headlines. We have a very, very little time left, but let's try to get both of these out there. Elizabeth Warren now says that the cost of Medicare for all could cost 2 million jobs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a hell of a lot of jobs.
Well, it's interesting she said that because for many, many weeks and months she wasn't explaining how she was going to pay for it. But the
as well as a couple of $1 trillion.
Yeah. Oh, no. To do Medicare for all, the budget to do that is going to be larger than Medicare, Social Security, and any of the programs that we have in the government right now. It will bankrupt this nation. We cannot afford. There is not enough money with the rich people, as they say, to finance all this. So then the middle class will have to do it. But more importantly, what if you lose 2 million? Neil, think about that. That's 2 million jobs, millions of families that are affected, not working anymore. To go where? What do? That's sort of like the Green New Deal. Oh, well, we'll just put the airline industry out of business. Well, how many people work in the airline industry? 1 million people? You're going to put 800,000, 1 million people out of business because the Green New Deal? What's that? What's the implication of that in the economy?
Well, the implication is you're not going to fly home to see Grandma on Thanksgiving because there won't be no more airplanes. That's terrible, Rich. I mean, that's terrible. Hey, look, we got to get this out there too.
All right, go.
Very important court case. We're not even hearing about it, but the U.S. Court of Appeals is about to make a ruling on the constitutionality of Obamacare. Now, remember, when Chief Justice Roberts joined the liberal members of the court, the 4 liberal members of the court, and voted to keep Obamacare, he said the mandate was a tax.
Exactly. He rewrote it himself.
And Congress has the authority to raise taxes. So the penalty of the mandate was a tax. Now that has been stripped out of Obamacare, there is no more penalty. There is 20-odd states got together and they filed, and it's now in a federal court. It's about to be decided upon. Now that there is no more mandate, this is not a tax. So the whole bill now is gone. Let me tell you, I mean, this is coming out any day now. I mean, this is earth-shattering news, and we're not even talking about it. Neither are the Democrat candidates talking about it. Because why? Because they don't even like Obamacare themselves. They want Medicare for all.
Yeah, it is very, very interesting. You're right. They are so far beyond Obamacare that Obama came out this week and said, we must be more civil in our social media. This is the guy who initiated all this stuff, 8 years ago. And even now he's looking centric compared to the rest of these cats that are out there. What happens if you have Medicare for all? There's no money. We bankrupt the nation. You erode the health systems in the United States. You have 2 million people not working anymore. All that tax base for 2 million people disappears. So you have created such a caustic environment to operate in. So I didn't even think they're talking about that. You know what? They're talking about impeachment. Impeachment is the blanket that covers everything. It covers everything for the time being because that's all they got.
Well, because I don't think that they feel they could win without it. Anyway, we're going to talk about that next week. But, Rich, we're out of time. Can you believe that?
This went fast.
Hey, but, Rich, don't worry. Because we're going to be back again next week for another adventure of Made in America, where we never stop fighting for your jobs.